So we're starting for a solid 6 or 7 weeks. We were looking at the book of Acts. And so we went from learning how to study the Bible to going into a book of the Bible itself to try to apply those things. And Acts is really good as a hermeneutical tool in and of itself. But we're going into some new stuff here. And this is, I call the class Foundations because, at least for now, everything I'm doing is based on building a foundation from which to study the Bible, from which to interpret reality, from which to make decisions, from which to really function with. There are just some truths that, as Christians, we need to have as our foundation. So this is going to be one of those things that's very core. It's going to be very foundational, for lack of a better word. So we're looking at, let's put it like this. Tonight we're looking at something called God's rule. And specifically, what does God rule over? Everything. Yeah, but... Us. Yeah, but really, it's God's rule over creation. Because everything that is not God was created by Him. So He rules over all that stuff. Over creation, and that does include us. That does include everything that's not Him. So you were right. It's just that specific word we're going to be using a lot. God's rule over creation. His rule over it, how He guides it, how He interacts with it, how He leads it. And I believe that it's crucial that we as Christians have a solid understanding of how God rules over creation, over the earth, over mankind, how He interacts with us. Because I've encountered this a lot, and you're going to encounter it a lot. A lot of people have either very bad misconceptions of how God rules over creation and interacts with man, or serious problems with the way they think He does, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. And you're going to need to have that foundation in and of yourself to be able to explain to them, well, that's not how God works. There are people out there who will not come to Christianity, who will not come to God because they don't understand something about Him. They think He is one way and He's really not, and they say, well, I don't want to go to a God like that. Which makes sense. I mean, if you take a lot of the common misconceptions of God that are out there, I wouldn't want anything to do with a lot of those versions of God. But the fact is, God is awesome. He's so great. And there's nothing in God that would lead somebody to not want to come to Him. And so as Christians, it's our job to know what He is and what He's like and be able to point people towards the true version of God, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. So anyway, this is one of the big ones. How does God rule? How does God interact? Okay, my son died in a car accident. Why did God kill my son? Questions like that are all over the place. Now, to what degree was God involved in the death of that person's son? This is exactly what this is talking about. God's rule over creation. So let's start with a real foundational question here. What is order? You can just throw out some synonyms or ideas or whatever. What is order?
An arrangement.
Arrangement, sure. Order is arrangement. What about within the realm of, say, society? Government? Government maintains order, certainly. Or it's supposed to. Say again? Organization. Structure. Not just organization. Get out. Structure. Yeah. Anything else? What is order?
I think like a way in which things function correctly or well. I don't know how to simplify that.
I'll just say the way things function correctly.
They were meant to.
way they were meant to, whatever that means, Tammy. Okay, what would you say is the opposite of order?
Chaos.
Yeah. Chaos is the opposite of order. And if really you just take all these words and flip them around, well, it is a total lack of arrangement, it's a total lack of organization, lack of structure. And if order is the way things function correctly, then chaos has got to be everything that's not functioning correctly. Not necessarily functioning incorrectly, but yeah, in a very broad sense. It's just every way you can possibly do a thing that is incorrect. It doesn't work right. It wasn't meant to be. Chaos, okay. Can human beings function in chaos?
Absolutely, we do it all the time.
Yeah. Sort of.
We don't function well, but we function.
Yeah, but I think maybe we have a pretty limited view of the idea of chaos. Because the chaos within our life, we're only able to recognize because we have extreme amounts of order all around us. But if you were to take away all of the order out of life, just pull it out completely, pull out all of this stuff,
Yeah.
could we function?
We'd self-destruct pretty
Could we
quick.
work?
Yeah.
I don't even think reality could exist as it is without order. I mean, because, okay, if you take logic, and I'm getting on a bit of a trail here, but logic, does anybody know what logic is based off of? Hey guys, come on in.
I'm not late because we got Starbucks, I swear.
But you got it for all of us too, right?
What?
You got some for all of us.
Of course. Everyone gets one sip.
I'll catch you guys up in a couple words. We're talking about God's rule over creation, how God works, how God operates and rules over creation. But we started by looking at the concept of order and its opposite, chaos. And we asked, can people function in chaos? And I believe that if you take all order out of reality, reality can't really function or exist as it does, if that makes sense. So we went here to logic. Now, does anyone know what logic is based off of? There's one law that logic functions off of. It's just core, it's foundational to logic.
Has to be reasonable.
Reasonable, yeah. But there's a specific term. Say again?
Deduction, maybe?
Deduction is a method. It's a logical method. Logic functions because of something called the law of non-contradiction.
That would make up that.
You guys ever heard of this? The law of non-contradiction. Any guesses as to what this means?
Logic can't contradict itself.
Yeah, so you can't have two truths that are contradictory.
So now your truth, my truth.
That's what logic would say. And I think reality functions around this whole idea of logic. But if I say, that doesn't exist, and you say, that does exist, logic says one of us is right. Because those are opposite states of being, existing and not existing. A thing cannot both exist and not exist. That's not logical. So because this works, a thing cannot both be, I gotta be careful here. A thing cannot both be water and a bus, if that makes sense. That's either a bus or it's water, or it's none of the above, right? No, that's obviously water, man. That's not a bus. Well, because of
Depends
this,
on what your definition of
because of this, we can't say, no, that is a bus. It's also water, and it's also a couch, and it's also the sky. It's also the universe itself, right? Well, because I mean, really, it's one thing or the other. It's yes or it's no. Now, yes, there's gray areas, but they still work within this law of non-contradiction. This is why reality can just work. This is why we're able to have conversation. We're able to have conversation because of this. Because of this. Because this is the kind of universe God created. It seems to be one that works around this idea. Not seems to. If you just look at the way things work If you look at science, you know why science can exist? Because of this. That's why we can look at things and we can make hypotheses and we can come to conclusions that things work the same way and oh, that works because of this. That's why we can understand human anatomy, why we can understand the laws of nature, because they don't contradict themselves. It's not like you wake up one day and suddenly everything we had decided the day before has now changed completely. Well, that would be chaos, right? But it doesn't work like that. It works by order. Reality works because it is focused on order. God created the universe with order and not chaos. And now we see relative chaos. I don't think there is any case in this universe of utter chaos. But we experience relative chaos. Like you said, well, we exist in chaos. There's definitely, I think within every single one of our lives, elements of chaos. And it's never pleasant, is it?
No.
People are like, I thrive off chaos. No, you don't.
This was a negative thing.
You really don't. Chaos is a bad thing.
Yeah.
How's your life right now? Well, it's a little chaotic. Right? It's a bad thing. It just is. So you can ask yourself, does God care about order? And I think the answer has to be pretty clear, yeah. Yeah, he does. Does God... Well, let's get more specific, because we were talking really big picture here in terms of the universe and logic and the laws of non-contradiction and all this stuff. Let's get specific. What about with human beings? What about societally? Does God care about order for us in our personal lives, in relating with other people, in our family lives, in our culture, in our nation, in our world? Does God care about order for human beings? Yeah. Okay. You say, of course he would. It's obvious God prefers this over that because he created the universe that way. So, of course, he would care about order for human beings. Yeah. There's one specific thing that God did for us that would lead you very strongly to the conclusion that God cares very deeply about order for human beings. Any guesses?
Sorry, can you repeat that? Kim was talking to me.
Say again?
Can you repeat that?
Yes. God did one specific thing for us, for human beings, that would lead us very strongly to conclude that God cares very deeply about order for human beings. Any guesses? One particular thing he did. It's in the Bible. I know there's a lot of stuff in the Bible.
No, there's a lot of things he did.
There's a lot of things he did. There's one really big one. One really interesting one. We probably take it for granted. One thing he gave us. Think of Old Testament. Stop thinking about Jesus.
The Ten Commandments.
Yeah, basically. Not just the Ten Commandments, though, because there were a lot more than just 10. God gave us, and I'm going to start erasing things. God gave man what we call law. God gave man law. And you have the formal law that was given around the time of Moses. Not around the time of Moses, to Moses. Before that, you have informal law. God would kind of give generalized commandments or specific commandments to specific people. But either way, God gave directions. God gave law. Now, let's think about some sort of big picture stuff, I guess. Why did God give us the laws that he gave us? Are we okay to erase this? Why does God give us the laws that he gives us? Why does he care? Because if you look at God's laws, he seems to not want us to kill each other. He seems to not want us to lie and to steal. He seems to dislike selfishness and adultery and anger and all this kind of stuff. Why does he care about those things?
It's in our best interest.
Yeah.
Yeah, he wants us to thrive.
Yeah. And this is one of those things that, like, I don't need to say this because everyone understands this. But what's really interesting is not everyone understands this.
No.
There's a very, very exceedingly common belief that God's laws have no deeper reason aside from God said so. But I think all you have to do is just read the Bible. Just read God's words to find his intention. He says, if you would just listen to the laws I gave you, everything would go well for you. Moses said in Deuteronomy chapter 6, he said, God gave us these laws that we would be able to survive, that we'd be able to thrive. He gave us these for our good, always, he said. So this is God's intention. It needs to be mentioned because understanding that God cares about order, and God's expression of caring about order for us is found in the law. And the law is an expression of, how did you say it? God gave his law, the specific laws he did because he cares about us. Because he cares about what's best for us. So if you have order, and God wants order, so he gave us the law, and both the law and order come out of his desire for
Our best interest.
our best. In other words, what do you call it when you care about someone's best interest? Love. It's the definition of love. And it gets really tricky nowadays because we have no idea what love means. We view love as a feeling as opposed to an action or an intention. But if you look, and this is where I like Noah Webster. If you look at Noah Webster's old school dictionary,
Yeah.
1812 original Webster's dictionary, there's a word you may have heard of called benevolence. And benevolence really, it's the closest translation we have to the Greek word agape, which is the kind of love that God and Jesus Christ love with. And benevolence means willing the best, willing the highest good, the absolute best for another person. Really, that's what, when you talk about God loves and Jesus loves, and we should love our neighbor, this is what this is talking about. Not just feeling good feelings for somebody. But yeah, God gave the laws he gave because he loves us, because he wants our best. He has our best interests in mind. Love wants the best for the one that is being loved. This is how it works. And so yeah, I've got to repeat this again, but God tells us what to do because he wants us to thrive. He wants us to work. He wants us to function. And you could say that God's laws are simply, and you said this with order, but God's laws are simply a description of how things should work. Simply a description of how things are going to function correctly. And if you don't do the things that he says to do, things are not going to function correctly. Not because he's going to hurt you, but because that's just the way it is. Just like you need to follow the directions when you buy a microwave or a bike. You should use it the way it's meant to be used. This is how it is. This is the heart behind the law. So, I think we know this is true to some degree, because I think we see it played out in reality. I don't think it's hard. I don't think we have to look hard to find people that we know that are just case studies of a messed up, dysfunctional life because they've just ignored this and done whatever they wanted to do, and they're experiencing the consequences of those things. Probably even our own lives. We can look at some pretty blatant examples and see, yeah, it seems to be the case that when I follow this, things go pretty well, and when I don't, things don't. It usually is that simple. Usually. When people do the things that God commanded them not to do, pain and destruction are the result every time. God told us not to do it for a really good reason. He didn't want us to experience that. And again, when people obey God's laws, things seem to go well. Hi, Taylor.
I'm really late.
You're all good. I'll recap you in like 10 seconds. We're talking about God's rule over creation, how God interacts, how God leads man. We're talking about the concept of order, and bottom line is God values order. The law is the expression of God wanting to lead us toward order, and the law comes out of his desire for our best, which is order, which is functionality. That's like a 10-second recap of the last 15 minutes. So, I mean, I think, like I said, I don't think we have to look far for examples of this. I think every single one of us can look at our own lives and see this is true. Personally, I know experientially that when I do the things I know God wants me to do, things are just going to go well. There's a peace and a joy and a mental stability that I don't have otherwise. Things just seem to work. I even tend to have better health when I'm walking in God's directions. It seems to work that way. And on the flip side, when I catch myself doing whatever I want for a couple weeks, I'm depressed, I'm guilty, I feel bad. Like, my body's deteriorating, I'm getting old. I'm just living stupidly. This seems to be the way it works for me. Because, the bottom line is we reap the consequences of our actions, for better or worse. We follow these, the consequences of our actions are going to be good. Consequence is not necessarily always a bad thing. Hi, Tony. I'm not sure if I want to catch you up or not. You'll be able to track. I don't say that wasn't a shot at...
Were you saying
okay.
I can track?
No, Tony taught this stuff.
Yeah, I did.
What?
Years ago, yeah.
Well, why?
I'll recap real quick.
I'm also going to launch the video.
You're good, yeah. God's rule over creation, how God interacts with mankind. God cares about order. The law is an expression of God's care about order, and the law comes out of God's desire for our best. Because there was a lot of other stuff I erased, but whatever. It's the bottom line. Yeah, like I said, we reap the consequences of our actions, for better or worse. Consequence is not always a bad thing. Consequences are often very good. And it is the case when we follow God's directions for our lives, the natural outcome, or the consequences of those kinds of actions are just going to be good. And on the flip side, when we don't, the consequences are going to be bad. Bad consequences. Real life consequences. So, it's something that we really need to get in our heads, and something that I think needs to be almost like a lens that we should be able to view God's actions through, is the basic idea that God always has a loving, intelligent reason for everything he does. Reasons, plural. It's really a lens, because sometimes you look at God's actions and you go, okay, why did he do that? I don't understand that. Well, like in the Bible, why did God do that thing? I don't get it. Often it can be confusing, but the Bible is very clear that he's just straight up love. He's just loving. That's what he is. Over all the other words the Bible could use to describe God, and there's a lot of them it uses to describe him, love is the one that it says he is synonymous with. In 1 John, God is love. He could say righteous, he could say indignant, he could say angry, he could say anything. But he didn't. He said, God is love. And really that's at the heart of all of his actions. So here's an interesting question. I like this question. Does God sin? It's really not that much of a true question. Good sin? No. Okay, good. How about this? Can God sin?
He chose to.
Tony says yes. Tammy says if he chose to. Just to let you know, both of you are erring on the side of serious heresy. Because a lot of people would say, heck no. No, God could not sin. And you say, wait a minute, you're the heretic because God's omnipotent. He can do whatever he wants. Can God sin? Could he?
Choose.
I think he could probably do whatever he wants to do. He's God. So why doesn't he?
Because he knows best.
Because he knows what's best. Yeah. Yeah. I like to put it like this. God can do whatever he wants. God doesn't just arbitrarily decide to do some things instead of other things. He seems to have consistency with the way he acts, with the choices he makes. I think, and this is my favorite way of putting it, I think that God is too smart to sin. Or, and I like this even better, he's not stupid, and therefore he doesn't sin. Make sense? Because every single one of us, to a degree, are pretty stupid.
Less intelligence.
Which is what, stupidity is a lesser intelligence of what it's being compared to. So, yeah, we're all pretty stupid compared to God. If you've ever sinned once, you're stupid. Because God knows that all those things he calls sin are just unintelligent, inferior choices. If you really want to break it down, you can get really, really messy talking about this stuff. Why does God choose to do what he did? Why did God choose to create man? Wait, was that the highest good? Was it not the highest good? Should he have not created man? It gets really, really messy, and if you want to talk about it after class, I'd love to. But the bottom line is God's too smart to sin. Because sin is just a word that we use to describe all of the bad choices you could make. People like to mysticize sin and turn it into like the boogeyman out to get you. Just a way of making a decision. And it's a bad decision every single time. Because again, the bottom line is God's every choice is focused on love. And love is at its heart a really smart thing to do. It's a very intelligent thing to do in comparison with everything else. And God never swerves from this course. He just doesn't. God is angry, but he never sins in anger. I'm sure God gets irritated with me. But God's commitment is this. He's too smart to do anything else. He's too great to do anything else. And so this is how God rules over his creation. He guides the world, he guides us, his creation, with perfect intelligence, perfect wisdom, perfect love, and he guides us in this direction, towards order, because he loves us, and he wants what's best for us, and he knows that this is what's best for us. So this is how he guides us. And one more thing we need to understand before we move on to sort of more practical questions. One more thing we need to understand is this. God is perfectly capable of ruling the universe. And he's the only thing or person that is perfectly capable of ruling the universe, guiding our lives and directing our lives. If you think of it this way, let's say your car breaks down and you have only 2 mechanics to choose from. And one of them is he's the nicest guy, and you've known him for a really long time. He's so friendly, he's so kind, and he cares about you. You know that he genuinely cares about you. So you know he's going to treat you right. He's a great guy. He's probably going to give you a discount because he loves you so much. He would never do anything to hurt you, but he sucks at his job. He's a terrible mechanic. He's terrible. He barely knows what he's doing. And then the other mechanic is a genius. He's got to be in the top 5 in the world in terms of mechanical expertise as far as automobiles are concerned. He's brilliant. You know that he's going to find exactly what the problem is. He's going to fix it. However, he's an absolute jerk. He's cruel and greedy and selfish to the core. And you know that he's going to rip you off as best he can en route to fixing the problem. Who do you take your car to? I choose death. I choose neither because, there's a nice guy who's going to not fix my car correctly, or there's a guy who's going to fix my car but is going to charge me way more money than I could afford. One of those, look, I was fixing, forget this, I'm going to learn how to fix the dang car myself. Bottom line is neither person is qualified to fix the car. The point being, if you haven't caught on already, God is perfectly qualified to rule the universe, to rule over every single one of our lives. because he is perfectly capable of handling our lives and our directions and any problem that can be thrown his way, but he's also perfectly loving down to his core. He's not concerned with just the end result. He's concerned with you and you and you and me and every single one of us along the way. That's why he's capable. Not just because he's all-powerful, not just because he's loving, because of both. Anyway, that is something we need to, it's important to consider. Because you'll find people who say, forget that. God isn't qualified to lead my life. I'm qualified to lead my life. But it's not true. Because bottom line is God knows what's best for us way more than we do. And he's really awesome because of that. Because of the way he leads. So we're going to jump into a bigger question in just a minute. But let's take a break. Okay, we're going to jump into one of the bigger questions. This is where it starts getting interesting. Maybe less interesting than the can God sin question, because that's one of my favorite ones. But definitely interesting. If God rules over creation, and he rules over man, and so I don't think anybody would disagree about that, but it starts getting messy when you go into what that actually looks like. Okay, God rules over creation, and he rules over man, he rules over us, but what does that mean? Like, practically speaking, what does that mean? We say God guides us, God interacts with us, God is sovereign over us. What does that mean? And you'll find there's no one Christian answer to that question. There are multiple Christian answers to that question. And the question, it can seem relatively simple at first glance. How does God rule over us? Well, this way, this way, this way, this way. But it's deceptively complex when you start to get into it. It's deceptively complex. So I'm going to start erasing this stuff because this is all very foundational before you start going into any of that. But I think we're good now. And we know that overcreation is implied under God's rule. But question. In your opinion, does God guide and interact with human beings the same way that he would guide and interact with a tree? No? What about like a stone? No. Well, what about like an animal?
No.
You find people who will say yes.
Yeah, I know.
I'm not an animal. Okay, so if the answer is no, why not?
Because they're incapable of reacting back or interacting back.
You're saying we are capable of interacting back?
I believe so.
Well, you're a heretic. Just kidding. Only to some people, you're a heretic.
Okay.
Only to some. There's a lot of them.
Yeah, there's a lot of
That's some number. I think to some degree, maybe to a large degree, you've got to say that human beings are different than everything else. Would you agree with that statement?
Yes.
With the exception of angels. And when I say angels, I also mean demons, because they're the same thing. Same kind of spiritual-only creature. We're different from angels because we have a spiritual aspect and a physical aspect, whereas angels have only the spiritual, and it still gets messy because we don't have a whole lot of information. But anyway, it seems to me that human beings, to some degree, whatever the degree is, are different from everything else. Plant, mineral, animal. We're different. And you wouldn't say that God interacts with a stone the same way he interacts with a human. I think reading the Bible is pretty straightforwardly true. So I think what you have to say is that God, and this is like one of those key statements, but I think what you've got to say is that God deals with each aspect of his creation according to its design. In other words, for each part of creation, God deals with it based on how he designed it. So a stone doesn't need to be dealt with in the same way that a human being does. It just doesn't. As for why, that's what will be unfolding, and we won't be able to get there completely tonight. But a stone doesn't need to be interacted with or guided or ruled over like a human being does. Neither does a plant. I would argue that neither does an animal. There's a difference. A difference in the way God needs to interact with us based on how he created us. So I think what you have to do is split, when you're talking about God's rule over creation, you've got to split his rule over creation into two categories. Now, I've essentially already done it. You have to split it into his physical creation and his spiritual creation. And if you're sitting there going, well, wait a minute, well, human beings also are physical. Or maybe human beings are only physical. And if you're confused about this whole concept of spiritual creation, or if you're watching the video and are confused about this, please reference the Foundation's online teachings on apologetics. Because we went into detail in terms of the difference between the physical and the spiritual, and how secular humanism says physical only, whereas, say, Eastern mysticism would say spiritual only. In reality, we're both, but at our core, we are spiritual creations in a physical body. But this is what we are. This is how we interact with the world, with creation. That gets kind of weird to describe, but that's generally the way it is. If our body disappears, we're still going to exist. Make sense? So again, you have to split it into God's rule over his physical creation and God's rule over his spiritual creation. Because there's obviously a difference. There is some kind of difference in the way he interacts with these two things. So let's briefly look at this side, because this side is going to take a lot of unpackaging. This is where it gets really tricky. This side we can handle pretty quickly, but it needs to be handled, so we're on the same page here. So when you're talking about God's rule over physical creation, again, God desires order, right? And law is God's way of guiding his creation to order, right? At least to some degree. So when you're talking about physical creation, where does the law fit in? What is physical law? Anyone? Bueller. What is physical law?
Things like gravity.
Yeah. Yeah. You guys heard of physics.
I'll get it louder.
The laws of nature. Right? Those are laws. Gravity is a good example. How does physical law work?
You can't break that law.
You can't break it.
All the time.
There's a key phrase here, and I'll just go like this. We'll just say physical law. There's a phrase here of cause and effect. I realize I'm not consistent with my caps. Don't point that out. Cause and effect. What does cause and effect mean?
If you jump off a cliff, you're going to fall
Yeah, but why?
because of gravity, because of the law of gravity.
Sure. So there's a cause, and it brings about an effect every single time. That's what it is. If I slap you in the face, it will cause pain. Pretty much every time. Unless there is a very bizarre set of conditions in which you cannot feel pain in your face, and then it wouldn't. But there's a cause that brings about an effect. That is always the way that physical law works. This is how it works in the physical realm, cause and effect. And so when you go, okay, so cause and effect works by physical law, but what is it? Like, what is physical law. What is a physical law? And really, you just say it's a description. It's a description of how things work. Now, you remember when we were talking about that other law that God gave humans, what was that?
How they should work.
How they should work. Now, what is the difference between that and that? Well, this one is should. This is what you should be doing if you want to work correctly. But in the physical realm, they just do. And they just always just work like this. It's a description. This is just how it is. It's just what it is. They're a description of how things happen in the physical realm. This is how it happens. You said gravity. Gravity is a description, like the law of gravity is just a description of how certain forces create certain effects. There are certain forces that cause things to fall, or really pull things towards their core. That's what the law of gravity is. It's a description of this thing that happens. An airplane is able to fly because it's created or built in strict adherence with the laws of aerodynamics. Aerodynamics are just a description of a reality, observation of a thing's mass and a thing's weight and lift and resistance, and it's just a description of realities, but it's the law of aerodynamics. It's a description of a thing. Heat boils water because of the law of thermodynamics. It's not the law that creates the reality, though. The law is just a description of the reality that's already there. Heat boils water, that's the truth. Thermodynamics describes the reality of what happens. That's what a physical law is. It just describes what's already there. It just always works like that. There's no should. If there was a should involved in physical law, we'd have a much more chaotic universe. You'd step outside and sometimes you'd be able to walk on the ground, other times you'd float up into nowhere. There probably wouldn't be a ground. Once again, it's a law of non-contradiction. In the physical world, we're able to exist in physical form because physical law is just the way it is. It's always this way. There's no contradiction involved. So, we already had answered the question, but are there deviations in physical law?
Yeah.
Is that a yes?
Yes. Well,
I don't know.
there can be, depending on
It can be, depending on conditions.
different laws interacting with.
Yeah, but in terms of one cause producing a certain effect under a certain set of conditions, will that cause produce the same effect under those same conditions every single time? Yeah. If they don't, well, there's something you don't know. That's how science works. Okay. You thought we understood this? Suddenly, there's some kind of variable we don't know exists. You find the variable, you understand it, and then you know what's going on. Then the cause will always produce the same effect. But in general, that's how physical law works. Cause and effect. Every single time. I guess you could say that the certainty of results is kind of one of those unfailing characteristics of physical law. The result's always going to be the same, under the same set of conditions, the same cause, it'll always bring up the same effect. Just the way it is. Cause and effect. So you could say, sort of, that God's will is always done in the physical realm. Why? Because God created the physical laws. He created the way things work. And the causes always bring about the effects. The way He created them to work. There's no should. There's no variable. It just works that way. And again, this is really the important part here. Cause and effect. This word is going to become very, very important later. Cause. But not right now. So, just to illustrate the concept of cause and effect again, in case we don't get it. A rock, a stone, is one of God's creations. It lands within the category of creation. And gravity is the law that God created, or the description of the reality of the forces that God created that makes things fall. So, let's say a stone falls to the ground. It is in adherence with the law of gravity, right? A law that God created. Is the stone worthy of praise? The stone's in the physical realm. It's obeying the laws that God laid down. Yes, a truly righteous stone. Well, that's silly. But why is it silly?
Because it has no other choice.
Yeah, well, why did it fall?
It's just acting as it should.
Yeah.
It was caused by the forces that exist in reality. Just, this is how it happened. The cause produced the effect. Was the stone, did it have any kind of part to play in it aside from just falling? It was just a thing that fell. Was it responsible for its actions? No. Is it accountable for its actions?
No.
If a stone falls in the forest and kills a lumberjack,
It's a big stone.
a big stone, it was a small lumberjack,
Probably
Small.
Depends on where it hits.
frail, he was mostly dead. Jim the lumberjack, mostly dead, very small, frail man. Anyway, rock fell in the forest and killed Jim the small, frail lumberjack. Is it responsible? Do you take the rock to court? You've killed Jim. You killed Jim. Lifetime in prison.
What were you thinking?
To the quarry. Well, no, because the rock had no responsibility or accountability. It was just caused, because that's how things work in physical creation. That's how things work with physical law. The cause produced the effect. The rock had no part in it. And so obviously it's like, what a ridiculous example, Nate, going to take a rock to court, you know, because it's a rock and that's silly, but it's also silly, and this is the part that's going to matter when we get to this part. Physical realm works by cause and effect. There's no option for the rock to do anything but react to the cause, which will produce the same effect under those conditions every single time. There's no variable, there's no option, there's no freedom of action. And when there's no freedom of action for the rock to do anything else, there's no responsibility or accountability for the rock. Right? It's important. Very important.
It's a good statement. You should write that, because I will forget it later.
You should write that.
Which one?
I already kind of lost it. If there's no responsibility, if there's no accountability.
You got it. I'll write it up here. If there is no... No, I'm getting ahead of myself. No freedom of action or, say, choice. There can be no responsibility or accountability. Make sense? That's a really important concept. That's how law works, guys. This is not just a physical law rule. This is also a spiritual law rule. That's why it's going to be really important. I might just leave that statement up there and erase all the rest of this stuff for next week. Maybe this will stay. Stay. I'll tell my janitor not to erase it. Oh, wait a minute. It's me. I'm the janitor. Yeah, so you guys get this general idea. The rock doesn't deserve praise for following the law of gravity. The rock doesn't deserve blame for following the law of gravity. It just was caused and it was an effect, and that's just the way it was.
What about animals?
Getting there, Tony.
I know. Sorry.
Animals is actually, I don't like to talk about it as much because it's one of those things where you're not going to find me wanting to give you a dissertation on angels or the end times or spiritual warfare, because the Bible is pretty much mum. I say pretty much not because it's completely mum, but because it's mostly mum compared to a lot of other stuff. If you talk about love, if you talk about pretty much anything else the Bible talks about. These things are very vague. So we should talk about animals though, because if you say everything else being like stones, plants, well, minerals, plants, and if you put animals in there, I mean, do animals work by cause and effect exclusively?
No.
Do they? I don't know. A lot of times it doesn't seem that way to me.
No. They can-
There, and this is again why I don't like to go into it, because I am not an animal. I've never met an animal who is willing to tell me the answer to this question. But there's one thing that we do know about animals that is sort of, you could say it's programmed into them, that works very much in the manner of cause and effect. Any guesses?
The survival instinct.
The second word. But yeah, instinct at its core is focused on survival. But instinct. And instinct, I think if there's anything that points you towards the idea of cause and effect in the animal kingdom, it's instinct. Because, so what is instinct? Your own words.
It's an irresistible drive to.
Yeah, a drive to do something. It seems like, I don't know if you can find a whole lot of cases that animals are like, I'm not going to follow instinct this time. They just do it. Instinct is like, it's a case of animals, not a case, but pretty much every animal has things that we can identify clearly as instinctual. And these cases of, oftentimes it's something that animals do, it's like amazing. They don't have to be taught. They don't have to sit down and figure it out. They just do it. And sometimes it's like really over the top and you're like, holy cow, that has to be instinct. Other times it's very basic. You know, the desire to protect young, the desire to eat, that kind of thing. But, you know, I don't think you find animals thinking and figuring out a lot of these complex actions and things they do. They just do them. I'll give you an example in a minute here. But they do them without making mistakes the first time. Like they do them right. It's bizarre. Human beings don't really work like that. We have a lot of years of trial and error before we can do like anything. We can't even walk. But yeah, you don't really get you don't really get the impression with animals that that they know why they're doing these things they do. They just do them. This is just something that needs to be done. And I tend to. What's that?
A lot of humans act that way too.
Yeah. I think there are basic instincts built into human beings as well. I don't think you get urges, hunger, sleep, whatever. But, I tend to think that God programmed instincts into animals. At the very least, this concept seems to work a lot more blatantly in the animal kingdom than it does with human beings. But I tend to think that God programmed animals with instincts to help them survive. That seems to be, you said survival instinct, and we hear survival instinct and we think like, I'll do anything to ensure I survive, I'll kill anything, I'll do it. But really, instinct at its core is about survival, whether it's violent or not. So, I'll give you an example here, one of those over-the-top examples of instinct. You ever heard of plover birds? Plover. Plover birds, they're migratory. So you know what migration is. Every year, plover birds fly en masse 6,000 miles from Alaska to Hawaii. This specific species of bird every single year does this. They're in Alaska. When it comes time for winter, it gets too cold, they go to Hawaii to sun for the winter. And then when it's all over with, they go back. But 6,000 miles. First of all, to me it's pretty amazing they could find their way. I don't know Maybe they sit down and like have meetings and train each other. I can't find my way around like a basic town that is square footage of like 10 miles square foot. I get lost very easily. 6,000 miles is a very long way to navigate, you'd say. So that's interesting as it is. But it gets really weird. And it's cases like this that make scientists go, what the heck? How? But obviously, this kind of trip, 6,000 miles is a long way. And there's no car or airplane involved. This is them and their wings. Bodied wings. Takes a lot of energy. So, one of the problems is a lot of this trip is over unfamiliar land, where they don't know where they can find food, or over water, where they just can't find food. So you really can't plan to stop and eat along the way. Plus there's a time crunch every year. So what do you do when you need that much energy? Well, when you get fat, it's because the body's storing that extra energy for a later time. So this is what the birds do. They eat a lot in preparation for this trip, and they all get fat. Every single one of them. They get fat, and like, we're going to prep all the energy. What's the problem with that? They're like, I'm going to run a marathon. I gained 50 pounds in order to get out the extra energy for the marathon. Well, it's going to be a lot harder to run with 50 extra pounds of energy on you. With all this extra weight they have, they're no longer able to, it's that much more difficult to fly that distance. I don't know why I did this. You know what flying is. I'm drumming. It's that much more difficult to fly that distance, weighing more. So, catch-22. You need the energy, but if you have the energy, you're too fat to fly. Not too fat to fly, but too fat to fly that far. So what do you do? And it took a what do you call it? When you get a bunch of geniuses together, a think tank. It took a think tank of the world's elite to come up with a solution for these birds. Just kidding, they figured out the perfect solution. They figured out the perfect solution. You ever seen birds flying in the V?
Yeah.
Do you know why they do that? Plover birds, to fix the problem, they need the energy, but they're too fat to fly. It's too difficult. It's basic laws of aerodynamics. The greater your mass, the greater your weight, the greater your resistance. And therefore the harder it is. So they have increased mass, increased weight, and increased resistance. It is that much harder. They have to figure out a way to decrease the resistance. So what the V is, and you can ask me to explain it, why this works the way it does, I couldn't. Maybe Taylor could. Her dad's a pilot. Bottom line is they fly in a V formation, and often they'll split into many V formations. I don't know how they communicate, like guac, 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 guac. And they all get, okay, Bob, you're over there, and they get into V formations. Bottom line is, the one at the tip here absorbs the majority of the wind resistance, creating a draft for the rest of these. In other words, it decreases the resistance all the rest experience by a large amount, making it possible for these guys to fly this far with their newly fattened bodies. And you'll notice the birds every couple hours. This one will go back here, and we'll all shuffle up. And for 6,000 miles they do this, and they get there. And they've used up all their energy, all their fat energy, and they've done it. Isn't that fascinating? Human beings aren't this smart.
Right.
That's the thing, it's because plover birds aren't this smart either. They're not. God is. This is why scientists go, what the heck? How? But Christians goes, well, it was God. Because it was. Pretty interesting. Well, this is something that they just do every single year. Do they have to have groups that sit down together and like, should we do the V's this year, guys? Do they have to decide, well, I think I'm going to stay back for the winter? No, they just go to Alaska in huge numbers. No, they go from Alaska to Hawaii and then back to the exact same nests. That's pretty amazing. And to me, it's very, very cause and effect. The cause was the instinctual programming, if you will. Programming is a little bit deterministic, but I guess that's the point I'm trying to make. The instinct was the cause, and the effect was they followed the instinct. And it gets tricky because when you're talking about animals of higher intelligence, it really gets messy. I've been deeply disturbed reading some of Jane Goodall's accounts of chimps. I recommend you don't read them. Not because it'll make you uncomfortable with this stuff, but because chimps are wicked little beasts, man. It's like turf wars where minorities were hunted down and murdered and raped and really messed up stuff. I can't read this anymore. I'd rather read about humans doing terrible things than these chimps. Long story short, it's tricky to talk about this in terms of animals in the cause and effect realm. But to at least some degree that we can identify, it's there. Whether this is 100% or whatever, I couldn't tell you. I don't think there's anybody who could tell you with intellectual honesty that they know the answer to this question 100%. What is certain is that there's absolutely a difference between this and this. There is. Even in the Bible it's stated, Psalms chapter 9, when the psalmist says, "You have made man a little lower than the heavenly beings, as opposed to everything else." Because we're different. We are different. So that is the physical creation. That's the physical realm. Minerals, plants, animals, all this stuff. This is how God manages over this stuff. And with this taken care of, we can move on to the really big one. And this is not like and here's my 20-minute explanation of the spiritual realm. This is something that'll literally be weeks in describing. Now, not weeks of every single day, but if you want to really get into this stuff, because here are the questions of determinism, free will, choice, this stuff we're talking about up here. How much of a human being, how much of this is involved in the nature of a man? And you'll find varied opinions. In the end, I will present to you different opinions, and I'll give you my opinion. But it's my opinion. I could be wrong. I don't think I'm wrong. But of course I don't think I'm wrong.
Who does?
Who thinks they're wrong? By thinking you're wrong, you think you're right about thinking you're wrong. What is today but yesterday is tomorrow. But we are at 7:22, and cracking open this is it's straight up a Pandora's box. So we're going to be done with moving into new material. Come back next week. This stuff is so cool.
Yeah.
It's so valuable. This is all foundational. If you can't make it next week, we have every single class recorded now. I saw the look. But
Tell your friends.
tell your friends.
Force your friends.
Any questions or thoughts on what we just talked about?
Let's talk about penguins.
Yeah.
They're pretty freaky, too.
Penguins are. There's all these movies like Happy Feet.
Yeah, they're like vicious.
These penguins aren't happy.
I don't know if they can see their feet.
What's that movie that talks about all the weird instinctual things that penguins do?
Oh, it was the one narrated by Morgan
March of the
Freeman.
Penguin.
March of the Penguins.
Yeah.
That was just, they had the penguin movie craze a while back.
Yeah. There was a penguin movie
That's
craze.
right, by Morgan Freeman.
There was Surfs, or that one Surf's Up, I think.
Surf's Up.
And then Happy Feet, Happy Feet 2, March of the Penguins.
But it's really interesting, like the whole like the guys sit on the egg for however long, whether the females go and get the food at 1,000-mile hike to the coast and come back in.
And they all like out of like hundreds of them or
Yeah.
whatever can like recognize like
They
the
mate for
calls,
life and
yeah.
everything, and they give each other gifts and stuff. It's really interesting.
Dude.
Penguins.
Some weird stuff. There's mandarin ducks. There's something like where if one dies, the other one will stop eating, and the one they mate for life, and they basically die. If one dies, the other one will die too.
Oh my gosh.
Really weird.
Yeah, I don't know what that from.
Or Black Widows, where they eat the husband whenever they
Right, this is the same same way.
Thank you, God, I'm human. Yeah. Yep, animals weird me out sometimes. It's not something you'll ever find me teaching an hour-long class on, that stuff.
Yeah,
Is
You know,
that- again,
dealing with animals,
you're not-
I can tell you an animal will rebel.
yeah.
And I don't think that's an instinct. I think that's, you know, they'll look you straight in the eye and they know exactly what they're doing. So,
It's crazy.
you know, it's kind of, it's a gray area. I mean,
There was like this video of this cat that was getting into the drawer, and they had the video like on, and the cat's getting into the drawer, and then it turns around and sees that it's being videotaped, and it pushes the drawer back. It shears flat and just goes down, cowers down. It knew what it was doing.
There was that video of, it had this like harmonica, like sad harmonica music playing, and this guy was looking through his kitchen at all like the torn up stuff.
Oh, yeah.
who did this?
Did you do this? Yeah. Yeah, it's definitely tricky. And again, you're not going to find me teaching, you know, a new series on spiritual warfare by Nate Evans because I don't think there's enough information. You're not going to find me teaching a whole lot of stuff on the end times aside from I address misconceptions about those things, but I'm not going to tell you all about them because the Bible doesn't.
Right.
And anyone who can tell you all about those things
Probably lying.
is probably lying. Yeah, or is probably someone you shouldn't be listening to. Now, I could be wrong about that. Maybe there are people out there that God has legitimately told everything there is to know about spiritual warfare and the end times. But it's not from the Bible. If it's out there, it's not from the Bible. So just keep that in mind. That to say, I'm also not going to be teaching a long thing on animals because, once again, the reason why you say it's not from the Bible and that's why it matters, the Bible is the one thing you can say, if it's in there and you've studied it correctly to get the right, like to pull out that principle, it's going to be true.
Yeah.
This is. It's 100% solid reference point. So anything else is scary to a degree because there is no verification. If you say, well, it's not in the Bible, but God told me,
Very
people have done terrible, terrible things because God told them. And I guarantee you God did not tell them. I don't know who told them.
Yeah.
It wasn't God. So anyway, that's a rabbit trail.
Yeah.
But as far as animal stuff goes, the Bible does not have... It has almost maybe like there's no direct statements about what animals are in terms of their nature. There are some things we can draw out of them, like God can apparently control them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Like the bear.
Apparently prophets can control them, like when Elijah called it was Elisha. The one you bald head.
I'll show you. Paul.
Apparently some 6-year-olds were making fun of him and he had bears maul them to death. Not true, by the way. That's a riff on a mistranslation or misunderstanding of the term youth.
Yeah.
That's a joke.
Anyway, oh my gosh, God bears mauled the babies in the Old Testament. No. Anyways, yeah, Balaam's donkey and
Which is awesome.
all that stuff.
The ravens
You don't really
and
see
the-
cases of that kind of meticulous control in the human spiritual realm.
Right.
Maybe. Do you?
That's it.
What about in Exodus, where God hardened the heart of Pharaoh?
Huh.
Ooh.
Dun, dun, dun. We'll be going there. We'll go there.
Yeah.
Oh, mark my words. But only if all of you show up next week.
No.
Oh,
I-
and God can go into the physical law and do anything.
That's the
he
thing.
wants with
There is no deviation barring miracles.
Yeah.
Because you see that. A miracle, you know what a miracle is when God momentarily sets aside the physical order that he created to accomplish something. But he always puts the physical order back in place.
Yeah.
So when people say, every day should be living in miracle.
Right.
No, if
We
God
live
wanted
in
us to be
chaos.
living every moment in miracle, he wouldn't have created physical order.
Right.
People always say like birth was a miracle.
It's not.
I was saying, it's 15.
By this definition, by the definition I'm giving you, because look, strictly speaking, a biblical miracle, this is what it is. When God performs a miracle, that's what it is. Now, by our human standards, birth is like a beautiful, incredible thing.
Yeah.
But God designed it to work that way.
They
Right.
use the word verity.
That is in, very literally, the physical order of
It's amazing
things.
that we
Hate
can
in childbirth.
There is absolutely cause and effect involved in birth, in conception,
Except for once.
and everything in between.
Whoa, 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 whoa.
That was the miracle
What
part.
are you saying?
Yeah. So,
That's awesome.
C.S. Lewis wrote a very illuminating book on miracles. It's called Miracles.
That's too much.
The problem with C.S. Lewis, though, is if you haven't met him before, I wouldn't recommend just jumping right into him.
Yeah.
If you're not,
He's
if you're not
simple as
used to
his
using your
title.
mind in that direction, don't start with C.S. Lewis.
Yeah.
He'll fry your brain. You'll be like, I'm never gonna read again.
His title seems simple.
But he's
but-
a genius. Is. I don't know. Should I refer to people who are dead but still existing in the present tense?
Oh, man.
Anyway, we're done.